The Iceberg Hermit, Chapter 21. As Alan watched the whaler draw away from him, he felt an overpowering anger. What was wrong with them? Could they not tell he needed help? Savagely he dug the end of the paddle into the sea, his arms a blur of motion. He sent the kayak skimming over the water in pursuit of the larger ship. Half an hour later he caught up with it. He noticed a rope trailing down the vessel's side, caught the end of it and let the larger ship tow him along. 4 or 5 faces stared down at him. Recalling his first meeting with the Eskimos, Alan shouted up, "In the name of Jesus Christ, take me on board." The captain joined the half-dozen sailors at the rail. He was Dutch and had, for the past hour, seen the Eskimo canoe on the water, obviously waiting for his ship. The canoe was handled so expertly, as Alan manoeuvred to keep his position among the ice floes, that the captain was sure that the person in the frail craft had to be an Eskimo. Then too, Alan was dressed in furs and skins, typical Eskimo clothing. The captain was anxious to get back to Holland with his catch, to get out of the Greenland waters before the ice caught him. He did not want an Eskimo on board. He did not want to waste an hour or two to find out that all the Eskimo wanted was to trade a mangy fox fur for some tea or tobacco. He was so sure that he had an Eskimo to deal with that even if Alan had spoken in Dutch, the captain probably would not have recognized his own language. But when Alan repeated his cry for help the 3rd time, the captain recognized the name Jesus Christ and some of the English words. Like most seagoing men of that time, he knew some useful phrases in half a dozen languages in addition to his own. For a long moment the captain stared down at Alan and Alan stared up at him. Silently, Alan prayed that God would make the captain understand. The captain shouted something and Alan held his breath. A dark bundle of some kind was being tossed out over the rail. Were they throwing garbage at him? The bundle stretched out and Alan recognized a rope ladder. He let out a sob and grabbed the end of the ladder. Then he stepped up on the bottom rung and tied the trailing rope to his kayak. A minute later he was standing on board the Dutch whaler Brielle, homeward bound for Holland. The captain invited Alan to his cabin and called for the ship's carpenter, who spoke English, to interpret for him. As Alan moved away from the rail, a flash of white on the shore caught his eye. He turned back and saw a polar bear scramble up a short dark slope and melt away into the heather. Although the bear was too far away for Alan to make out more than the animal's general size and shape, he called softly out over the water, "Goodbye, Nancy." An hour later, in the captain's cabin, Alan learned to his astonishment that he was 1 week short of having spent 7 full years in the Arctic. In turn, the captain found it hard to believe Alan's story and questioned him again and again. Indeed, in the following weeks, the ship's carpenter was constantly asking Alan to answer the questions of the captain or members of the crew. In return for passage home, Alan gave his kayak to the captain. He also traded all his Eskimo clothing to members of the crew for regular European clothes. 3 weeks later, the Brielle halted briefly off the eastern coast of Scotland to transfer Alan to a small coasting vessel. The coaster eventually took Alan back to Aberdeen. When he arrived in his home port, he stepped off the trading ship, and the only souvenir he had of his 7 years in the Arctic was his poor, worn-down carving knife that had helped kill 2 polar bears. The day Alan landed in Aberdeen, he left the keys and made his way to Princess Street. It was an unusual afternoon for that part of Scotland, a warm sun with not a trace of cloud in the sky. As he walked up Princess Street, he wondered if Nancy would recognize him. He had changed, had grown a good 3 inches, and had added 30 pounds to his weight. He was also wearing a full blonde beard and hair down to his shoulders. He passed by Craggie's tailoring establishment and thought with special fondness of that skinny 12-year-old lad who used to work there. Finally he stood on the wooden sidewalk outside McLean's drapery shop. He lowered his head and peered in the window. There was a young girl standing behind the counter where Nancy used to stand. He went inside and nodded to the elderly woman who was seated at the high desk. Then he walked down the aisle and stopped in front of the girl. He wanted to ask her for a penny's worth of black velvet ribbon, but he had no money in his pocket. Indeed, He had not handled any money in over 7 years. "May I help you, sir?" the girl asked with a smile. "Yes." Alan found it difficult to ask the question, for he was still not used to speaking English again. "There was a girl worked here 7 years ago, Nancy Campion. Does she still work here?" "Oh, no, sir. Nancy left a couple of years ago. She lives in Edinburgh now." "In Edinburgh?" Alan repeated. "Yes, sir. She married a solicitor's clerk from there." Alan turned away and left the shop. He should have expected that, he told himself. Why would she wait 7 years and her not knowing if he was alive or dead? And yet he did not expect that she would be married, and somehow he felt hurt that she had not waited for him. Lost in his memories, his feet automatically took him along the well-known streets and alleyways of his boyhood. By coincidence, he walked past the ironmonger's shop where he had left his gift of grapes for Nancy so many years before. He remembered his promise to bring her back some grapes from Vinland and smiled. Minutes later, a small elderly man, coming out of a bakery shop, almost bumped into him. The man muttered something and hurried away. Alan stopped to stare after him. It was Master Duff, and he had not changed a bit. There was still that thin nose and tight-pinched lips and deep-set suspicious eyes. For a moment Alan was tempted to run after the master, to stop him and demand an apology for those remarks of so many years before. But instead he laughed. What difference did it make? He did not feel hatred anymore. It was all gone. It was funny, he told himself. But two things had kept him alive all those years in the Arctic: his hatred of Bunty Duff and his love of Nancy Campion. And now that he was back home, he discovered that he did not need that love, nor that hatred either. They had already served their purpose. In fact, he didn't need anyone's good or bad opinion of him. He knew exactly who he was. He was Alan Gordon, 24 years old, and strong as an ox, smart enough to have lived through experiences that would have killed a dozen others. He knew who he was and what he was capable of, what he was made of, and that was a gift far greater than the treasure that the old fortune-teller had said he would bring back from his voyage. He would go home now to his mother and sisters and talk for half the night, and finally climb the ladder to the loft above the kitchen and sleep in his old bed and feel just like a 12-year-old again. For one night at least, because in the morning there was a whole new world waiting for him, and somewhere a new Nancy. And as he walked through the pleasant sunshine, he raised his hand and touched the invisible gold ring in his ear, then smoothed the feathers of the imaginary parrot that sat on his left shoulder. The velvet lad was gone for good, but Iceberg Gordon had finally come home. That's the end of the book. Hope you've enjoyed The Iceberg Hermit by Arthur Roth. Good night. Sleep tight.